Our reading this morning from the first book of Samuel begins with a statement that is very powerful, apropos where we find ourselves right now. Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul. It's an important verse, I think, because it teaches us important things about grief we need to hear right now. Now, I think as a society, we are actually generally pretty uncomfortable with expressions of grief. I mean, yes, we will allow when somebody dies that people should be permitted a certain time of grief. But we kind of often treat it as if that's what it is, that it's something we are letting them do. And actually, we can often be rather impatient when people do not process grief as quickly as we would like them to. So I have known, for example, people who ask others, "How long will you grieve your loss?" And I know that that is a very unhelpful and sometimes very hurtful question. Because the fact of the matter is that every person processes grief in their own way and at their own pace. And we need to be very respectful and give people the space they need to do that. And I think it's also important to recognize that this pandemic, this whole situation, has brought a lot of grief with it. We have just lost too many people to the virus and also to secondary effects like canceled surgeries and an overwhelmed healthcare system. And one of the hard parts of all of this has been that people have not been able to mourn in the way that they may need to. And I certainly feel that we will find that we will be carrying the emotional scars of this experience for a very long time. And we will need to learn to be patient as people continue to process the grief of the pandemic, and that it might take longer than it would under ordinary circumstances. But this reference to Samuel's grief over Saul is a reminder of something else about grief. Because you see, Samuel's grief for Saul is not a grief for a death, because Saul is not dead. And he won't be dead, not for a long time yet to come. Saul is also still the king, and he will continue to be king for a long time to come. There's actually very little about Saul that has really changed. He's still the same man he always does. He still has the same strength and the same weaknesses that he always had. All that has actually happened is this. There's been an incident that has demonstrated Saul's weaknesses and shown that they will prevent him from being the king that he really needs to be. And I don't really want to go into the incident too much. Basically, Samuel had given Saul some clear instructions about what to do when he went to war, and Saul disregarded those instructions. Just one incident. But it really awakened Samuel to the truth that Saul's weaknesses would never really be overcome. So, what exactly is Samuel grieving for in this passage? He hasn't really lost Saul. All he has lost are his own illusions about who Saul is and who he could be. And I think it's one thing, and a very necessary thing, obviously, to grieve when you've lost someone, or when you've suffered another real loss in your life, like the loss of a supportive community, or something that gave you a sense of identity. But it is quite another thing to grieve the loss of your own illusions. But apparently that is what Samuel was doing. And I think in many ways that explains the impatience that God shows to Samuel in this passage. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul?" You see, God understands our grief. God is full of compassion for anyone who has lost a loved one or suffered another significant loss in their life. I don't believe God will ever come to someone who struggles with such things and say, "How long will you grieve over this loss or that loss?" Oh, God is willing to walk with you through such a time of grief, however long it takes. And we indeed ought to be as willing, as best as we can, to do the same for our sisters and brothers. But when what you are grieving is not a loss of something or someone you hold dear, but rather the loss of your own illusions, the loss of your false ideas of yourself, about yourself and about the world, well, then maybe God's not going to show exactly the same patience. Let me give you an example from current events. At the end of last month, Canada was rocked by a gruesome discovery. Researchers at the former Indian residential school in Kamloops, British Columbia, announced that their surveys had revealed the remains of 215 children as young as 3 years old, some of them, in an unmarked mass grave. And that revelation has unleashed an unprecedented wave of grief across this country, both among Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. And this loss is a very real loss. Yes, these children may have died, some of them many years ago, but each one of those bodies represents a life cut brutally short. And indeed, there's every reason to believe that abuse and neglect and malnutrition played a role in many of those deaths. Local Indigenous communities are also dealing with the grief of the loss of lives of their own relatives that they never got to know, even if, of course, individuals may never be identified. Even more important, these 215 bodies are also a very graphic reminder of all of the children who suffered, all of the children who died in all of the residential schools. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission estimated that somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000 children died. And that's actually a very conservative estimate, by the way. You can tell it's a conservative estimate because they had estimated that only 51 children had died at the Kamloops school, and we now know how wrong that was. So there is indeed so much to be grieved. And every manifestation of that grief, the flags flying at half-mast, the displays of shoes and other memorials, are fitting. And I hope that they will be healing. And I certainly hope that no one tries to put a timeline on this grief or to tell people that they've been dwelling on it too long. I believe that God has infinite compassion for those who bear the pain of such a loss, and so should we. But there's also another grief that this discovery has stirred. For some people, this discovery has meant a loss of their own idea of what Canada is. It has represented the death of the notion that maybe because Canada did not go about it with the same kind of direct violence that the United States did, that Canada was more noble and less racist in its relationship with Indigenous people. That's an idea we have clung to in many ways. And of course, there have been indications around for a very long time that that idea of Canada was not realistic. I mean, if you've been paying attention If you've read the reports of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if you've read the reports on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, if you've had much contact with First Nations people, then likely this gruesome discovery at Kamloops did not come as a surprise to you. But of course, actual bodies are a little bit harder to ignore than so many numbers and statistics. And so for some people, this whole revelation has forced them to face up to certain truths, a certain dark past and present reality about this country that we love. And I think that this particular grief is a little bit more like Samuel's grief over Saul. Because you see, of course, the fact of the matter is that nothing has actually changed about Canada from last month to this month. It's still the same country it always was, the same flawed country that it always was. So what we're dealing with here is our loss of ideas and maybe illusions about our country. And this is a loss. And some people are dealing with this loss like they would with any loss, by going through a time of grief. Psychiatrist Elizabeth Kubler-Ross taught that there are in fact 5 stages of grief that people go through as they deal with a significant loss: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. And one way I know that some Canadians' grief is grief over their loss of this idea of Canada is that you can see and read evidence of all of these stages of grief. I've seen articles trying to deny that things are as bad as that things were as bad at the school as this makes it appear. We've all certainly seen demonstrations of anger, often that try to deflect blame onto this party or that one. Whether it be the Roman Catholic Church or John A. Macdonald or Edgerton Ryerson or, sadly in some cases, the Indigenous communities themselves. I've seen a lot of bargaining. I've seen a lot of depression. And of course, it's also heartening to see people accepting the truth that, maybe this country was not exactly what we thought it was. So there is indeed a sense that people are grieving not only for the loss of 215 children, but also for the loss of their illusions about themselves and about their country. But this story of Samuel is there to remind us that God does not respond to those 2 griefs in exactly the same way. God is sympathetic to those who need to grieve for their loss of their illusions about their country, yes. As we lament the loss of our innocence, as we beat our breasts, as we come to terms with our failures, God will be patient with us. And yet I also know that the point will come when God came to Samuel, and God will come and say, "How long will you grieve over Saul? I've rejected him from being king over Israel. Fill your horn with oil and set out." The point will come, and the point will come soon, when we need to get past dealing with our emotions about this and move on to action. We need to fill our horn with oil and set out and embrace a new and better future. And what, in this case, what will filling that horn with oil look like? I suspect that it will include things like moving ahead with a survey of all residential school properties so we can get a realistic account of part of what we have lost. I suspect it will also include the federal government dropping its opposition to certain lawsuits that have legitimately been put forward by survivors of the school system. In fact, honestly, there's no lack of actions that can be taken, because actually very few of the recommendations of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report and the report on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls have been implemented. We actually have a pretty good idea what next steps can be. And I kind of hear God saying, so fill your horn with oil and set out. And of course, I would also remind you of the challenge put forward by our own Sunday school kids. Their action has been to take $215 from the funds that they have raised and give it to support the work of one of the Indigenous ministries of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I would challenge us all to consider doing likewise, to make a symbolic donation in support of one of these ministries or in support of one of the local Indigenous organizations. Between now and Canada, can we consider what we can do with our generosity to lay a foundation in practical terms for a better nation for all? Fill your horn with oil and set out. Now, I have gone on a bit here about one particular example of the kind of grief that Samuel was suffering from, because, of course, it's the hot topic of the moment. But before I leave this passage, I think we need to recognize that there are also other times when God will react in the same way to our grief over our lost illusions. I see a similar pattern played out, for example, every time a major mass shooting takes place among our neighbors down to the south. The pattern has become so repetitive that it is indeed now a cliche. You know, first, as soon as there's one of these great big mass shootings, all of the people in power, they send out their thoughts and prayers, right? And this is followed almost immediately by these cautions as people say, oh no, people are grieving. This is not the time for political discussions. This is not the time to do anything. That's the pattern, and it keeps on happening. And every time I hear that pattern repeated, it's like I hear God shouting from heaven, how long will you give me your thoughts and prayers? Fill your horn with oil and set out. I also suspect that the church and other institutions in our society are at a very similar moment. Because you know what? This pandemic is going to change many things about our institutional life. Things will be lost, and some of these losses will be genuine and will need to be grieved at the end of this thing as we realize what we have lost forever. But there's also something else going on, because the unusual challenges of this moment have also exposed us to some of the false notions we have been clinging to about our churches. This has forced us to think differently about how we minister to families, how, where, and when we worship, and how much we need to embrace the reality of being the church outside of the building. These are actually lessons, my friends, we have been needing to learn for a very long time, but they have been thrust upon us during this particular season. And I think many people are still reeling from the loss of how they thought things were supposed to work. So I will warn you that while God is very sympathetic for our grief over our losses, there is also some impatience. And God will be asking, how long will you grieve? And are you ready to fill your horn with oil and go? It is time to embrace a new and different future. So I believe the moment is coming when God will ask us what God asked Samuel. How long will you grieve? Fill your horn with oil and set out. Gracious God, thank you for how you've challenged us with some recent events to rethink how we see ourselves, how we see our nation. These are hard things to come to terms with. Thank you for your patience with our grief, but also give us the strength to build a better future together in all that we do. Amen.